Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have ex-Big Law recruiter Sadie Jones with us to talk about what matters in law school long-term for your career. Your Law School Toolbox host today is Allison Monahan, and typically I'm with Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together with the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website, Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started. Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have ex-Big Law recruiter Sadie Jones with us to talk about what matters in law school long-term for your career. So welcome, Sadie.
Thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. Well, as this school year draws to a close, we're actually recording this in early June, students are starting to look ahead at the rest of their time in law school. So for career purposes, what kind of things do you think people should be considering, particularly if they've just finished their 1L year and they have this kind of panoply of options before them?
Well, I think there are a lot of options, and just to kind of go through what they are, and I'm not necessarily ranking them with talking about them. You could do a journal, you could do moot court, you could do an internship, an externship, clinics, you could help as a TA, you could have some kind of outside activity. So there's lots of different options, clubs.
Right, and I think also people think, about the classes they can select. Activities I did personally, like maybe pro bono work. Some people like to participate in things with their local bar association or even more globally. I know the ABA has a lot of activities students can get involved in. RA positions, you mentioned TAs, and then outside jobs, whether that's, a paid legal job or some other type of job. So of all these things and, any others that we can probably think of later, what do you think employers are really most interested in typically?
Well, I think they're kind of most interested in things that are substantive. So things that aren't just sort of looking like filler on your resume, but you actually have to put some work into and you have to show your skills to do them. So I do think that journals can be good. I think it depends what it is. I think it's great to pick one that is in an area of interest. I think moot court is great, particularly if you're interested in litigation or you kind of want to push yourself in those skills. Obviously, law review is always the number one if we're talking about activities. And I think we've discussed that before. And obviously, that takes the most time and effort, and it's not something that everyone can just do. But I think that these are all great. I do think like an externship and internship is also great. I don't think that's really expected, to balance that with your classes. But if that's something that you can do, so I would just focus on the substantive options.
What about other jobs? I mean, you think people look at someone's resume and they're like, oh, this is great. You worked 20 hours at Starbucks as a barista, like you were balancing your life. I mean, I know people do that a lot in undergrad. Is that kind of a thing in law school?
So I actually think there are situations where that's helpful to show. I would only do it if you need to do it. Like if you are putting yourself through school and that is what is paying for your life and it's something that you need, and you are able to balance the other stuff. So you need to be able to be doing well in your classes along with that. I actually think that employers look positively on somebody who's like, I need to work in order to pay for my life and I'm still doing really well in school. I wouldn't pick that just to show that skill. I would do it if that's the truth and that's what you need to do and you're able to do well in school.
Right. I think all of this really circles back to that point, which is, ultimately one of the things that obviously matters long-term is your law school grades. So if you had to rank grades versus any of these other activities, what do you think people should really be focused on?
Grades are so far and above any of these activities. So my advice would be not to even consider absolutely anything if your grades aren't there. If you are not able to balance the work and any of these activities, I don't really think the activities matter anymore. So you need to know that you can study and you can do well, and you're succeeding at the school part of it, because I think that if you're coming from sort of an undergrad perspective, that those outside activities sometimes balance more with the grades. And with law school, your grades are just the most important.
Right. And the reality is, unfortunately, if your grades are not where you might want them to be, you're not actually going to be able to participate in a lot of these things anyway.
Exactly.
So you mentioned law review earlier. Obviously, you're probably not joining the law review if your grades are subpar. I mean, maybe you could do a writing competition, and maybe there's some sort of like Hail Mary situation where you do end up joining, but your odds are not very good there.
Definitely. Although I will say on that point, if your grades are sort of borderline and there is an option to like write on to law review, or you have any way that you can do it, I do think that can actually help.
Oh,
that
for
it's
sure.
Looked at so strongly. So I'm not saying that that's a common situation, but I've seen it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I definitely had friends who were on the law review with me, and, we were at a fancy school. People think like, oh, maybe that doesn't really matter, but it definitely mattered. Their grades were not in position to put them onto law review, and they wrote on, and they said instantly, they got all these new interviews at OCI. They had all this interest from clerkships. It was pretty obviously a big deal even there.
Absolutely. Although I will say in that situation, again, you still have to weigh whether you can handle law review and keep your grades even at the level that they're at, because you don't want them to take a dive.
Right.
It's not going to completely make up for that.
Although the reality is, in your second and third years, you also get to pick your classes. Yeah. So,
true.
If you're maybe better at writing papers, you can do that. If you get, if you only really can focus on classes you're interested in, you get to pick them. So, I think people do need to understand there's more flexibility. And typically, if somebody wants their grades to go up as a 2 or 3L, that can happen.
Absolutely.
Right. And even with things like clinics and internships and externships, a lot of those actually have an application process. So, we don't want to discourage you if your grades were not where you wanted them to be, but I think you do have to be realistic about some of these opportunities, particularly depending on the school that you're at.
Absolutely. I also think, think about the kind of job you're looking for. So I'm speaking from a more law firm perspective. I think that if you're looking at more public interest work, that they do want to see your commitment to that sort of work. So I think some of these outside activities can be helpful to kind of show where your interest level is, and that this is something you're sort of on a path for. Remember that all of these choices are telling your story, and they're sort of adding up on your resume to show them who you are. So again, in those jobs, your grades still matter, and a lot of those jobs are very competitive. But I do think that they look at where you're spending your time.
Oh, definitely. I mean, one of my roommates in law school was very public interest focused. And I remember at some point after her first year, I think she literally just stopped looking at her grades. Like, she didn't even know what they were. She had someone else. Yeah, like, it was kind of crazy. She had a friend look at her transcript every semester, basically to make sure she was passing her classes and like wasn't in danger of not graduating or things. But she was like, that doesn't matter to me. It doesn't matter to the people I'm going to be working for. Like, what matters is what I'm spending my time doing. And I don't want to be stressed out about like, did I get, a B- in this stupid class that I don't really even care about. Like, that's just not what I'm interested in. I thought that was pretty crazy.
That I've never heard anything like that. But I think that's really interesting. And I wonder, that she could have gotten something different out of law school, than a lot of people do. I will say on the reverse front, if you are looking for firm work, you might want to think about the story that you're telling if you are doing a lot of public interest work. So you can have some for sure, and especially 1L summer, a lot of people are going to get those kind of jobs. But if it skews too much that way, you're going to get the question from the firm, do you want to work here?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think everyone's looking for someone who's genuinely interested in what they do. So the more that you can sort of know what you want to do and shape your experience so that it all kind of adds up and makes sense. And it's fine if, there's some other things on there you did pro bono that doesn't relate to like, you know, the firm, it's like, okay, they're fine with that. It's pro bono. But, you know, from your classes that you're taking to these internships or externships, I mean, I think clinics are really one of the best things people can do in law school, both for personal development and for career development. I mean, how does a firm view that?
Yeah, I think that's a great option. And I think it's something that's really nice to talk about. Like, it's something that you can say a lot about and talk about what you got out of it. And it's interesting. And so I think any kind of real world experience is helpful.
Right. I mean, I remember doing a clinic. I'd come in, you know, I was a programmer before I went to law school, and I did this clinic on lawyering in the digital age. And it was super interesting. You know, it was an interesting clinic for me to do. It was really interesting projects. Like as partners, we worked on projects that were real world projects. So my partner and I worked with the housing court in New York City with the idea we would design essentially like a form that low-income tenants could fill in, because most of them, frankly, were unrepresented, and you know they had these defenses, they didn't know about them, and the defenses were statutory, so it was literally kind of like a checkbox, like, did your apartment like not have running water last week, you know, that kind of thing. And it was really designed to put them on like a more level playing field, and so that ended up being a really interesting project. We ended up, my partner and I were like recognized at the state of the state like judiciary address. We had to go to Albany. It was kind of a crazy scene.
Wow. Yeah. And I think that's great if you pick something you're genuinely interested in. I mean, that's my advice on all of this. I don't think that you should tell a story that you think they want to hear either.
Right.
You know, like you can put your focus on, you know, the things that we're saying maybe are sort of higher value, you know, choices, but pick things that you are really interested in, because it's not going to come across right if you're, you know, pushing yourself in a direction that's not you.
Right. Well, also, I think, you know, sometimes people think they should do these activities that they really don't like because it might improve their job prospects. But I feel like at that point, you really have to ask yourself, like, is this the right job for me? You know?
Exactly.
If I'm doing this thing I really don't want to do, and it's making me miserable because I think it's going to get me this job because that's what they're looking for, maybe you need to reevaluate what you're doing.
100%. And I think you can find yourself in that situation really easily in law school, where you end up somewhere that you haven't really like wanted to end up because it's just the way things were moving. And so I think that's a great point to like take a step back and think, do I like this? Am I enjoying these things? Like, am I interested?
Right. And you can always evaluate that, you know, as you go too. Like, I will be honest, I absolutely hated law review. Like, I hated every second of site checking. I just hated the entire thing. I found it was like such a waste of time. And then, you know, it comes around at the end of your second year and everyone's like, oh, you know, who's going to run for the board? Like, you should run for the board. And like, there's all this pressure to do that. And I just remember having these conversations with people who are like outgoing 3Ls, and they're like, you know, you should really run. Like, you'd be great. I'm like, I don't want to do this anymore. Like, I hate this. And they're like, oh, but, you know, it would really improve like this prospect and that prospect. Maybe you get a better clerkship. And someone was just like, I don't care. Like, I just don't want to be doing this anymore. So I got to become like, I don't remember. There was a big fight for the social chair and like alumni chair, because that was like how you got out of having to do anything. So I was one of those. I can't remember which one. Alumni chair, I think.
Good for you for making a decision for yourself and
like
your own, you know, well-being.
I did not regret that 1 minute. Like, all I did the whole year for law review as a 3L was like write a couple of newsletters and plan a banquet. And I'm like, this is awesome.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a typical law review experience.
No, it was great. I got to go down to the like club we were hosting it at and like do some tasting menus. And I was like, cool. All right. Yeah, we'll have that. We'll have that. And everybody else was like site checking away. I'm like, this was the best decision ever.
That's really funny. I mean, the thing to remember also about these choices is they're probably going to ask you about them in interviews. So you want to be able to talk about them, you know, and have something interesting to say and mean it. Mm-hmm. So just having a bunch of stuff, which I see a lot, and I think does kind of read as not genuine. You know, when you have too many activities, it feels like you're just sort of filling out a resume. And I find that those students have more trouble talking about them because they didn't really like have the experience. They just had it on their resume.
Right. I think you see that with someone's in like 10 different clubs. And it's like,
yes.
Okay, so what does that even mean? You know, the thing about clubs is like, fine, join a bunch of them. I wouldn't put them all in your resume just because. And also, I think if there is one that you're genuinely more interested in, it's pretty easy to become a board member and that type of thing. You know, you can be like the vice president of whatever club. You don't really have to do much. It just means basically you control the money that the school is going to give you to have events probably. And that's like always good. But, you know, then you can put it on your resume as like, oh, I was the vice president of like the Real Estate Law Society or whatever. And someone's going to be like, oh, what did you do? And you actually have an answer to that question.
Absolutely. I would say that you shouldn't have more than one and possibly two clubs on your resume. And they should be clubs that mean something to you. You know, you're trying to say something like this is a cause or an area that I'm interested in. And I agree with you. It's not hard to get on the board. And I do think getting on the board, sometimes you make connections. You can sort of network. Maybe if they're like putting on an event or something like that, that's great. That's
the thing is like it basically gives you this position where you can call up people that you're interested in talking to or email them and be like, hey, we'd love to invite you, you know, to give a virtual talk on whatever topic at this, you know, event I'm hosting at the law school. And like a lot of people will actually be flattered by that.
Yeah, I think that that's a great option. I just think that if you have like 6 or 7 clubs on your resume, you're not getting anything out of that. That doesn't mean anything. It's just taking up space. So employers, they're not going to care.
Yeah, I think the one exception to that is some affinity groups can be useful if you're trying to signal something. That's a little bit different. But yeah, if we're just talking about like, you know, whatever type of law, like club, it's like, okay, you're not really that interested in 10 different things.
Yeah, and I agree with you on the affinity group, although again, like focus on something.
Right. I'm just saying that can be a useful signal. If you think it's something people might be looking for, then like don't drop that.
And that's the best way to tell people that.
Right. Exactly. We get a lot of resumes. We're always like, oh, okay, yes, your point has been made. Yeah, so you briefly mentioned this earlier, but let's circle back to it. To what extent do you think the type of job that people want should determine the type of activity that they're focused on? You know, so for example, if I'm like a would-be litigator, say that I didn't get on the law review, I'm deciding between like moot court and a random journal that's like in a topic I don't hate, but I'm not that interested in.
Yeah, I think that it definitely could inform it. And I think moot court is a really good option. I think sometimes it's a little overrated. Like students think it says something more than it does. So I think it's positive. I think it could give you important skills. Like aside from what you're telling the employer, I actually think you can get something out of it. I think even people who aren't inclined to litigation or who struggle with those skills, I actually think moot court could be a great option. And I don't know if that would be a popular point of view. People might be scared of it, but that's advice I would have is try something different. But I think that could mean like more than other things, if that's the direction you're going, because you can directly say like, I was doing this, I was working on this, this is my focus.
Yeah, I think, you know, if it's something you're really committed to, you want to be able to talk about that and make it clear on your resume that this was a big commitment of your time and energy. You know, and what do you think about, sometimes we get people wondering like, well, what if I want to do this for my skills development or just for my own general development? I want to force myself or push myself to be a better public speaker and to be more comfortable, but I'm pretty sure I'm not going to win. Do you think it's bad to do something like that and then not win? Like, you know, you don't even make the semifinals or whatever.
No, I feel like people don't even look at who won, to be totally honest. I think the students are really excited if they won or they got some award. And I have actually never seen anyone on the employer side really even look at that. You just kind of see what they did. I think just because people don't necessarily spend that much time looking at your resume as much as you have. So it's great to show off if you did, but I absolutely don't think that's a reason not to do it. They're not going to know how you did.
I mean, honestly, if somebody sent me a resume that said they did this like whatever random moot court competition and they didn't put anything else, I would not assume anything about like how well they did or anything like that. I mean, maybe I should, but like I wouldn't.
Yeah, I don't think anyone.
It wouldn't even occur to me to wonder.
I mean, unless somebody is like particularly interested in moot court or they went to that school and it's like something that's really important to them, but I don't think that's going to be like a common problem.
Well, even if somebody brings it up in an interview, you know, how far did you get? Oh, you know, it was a really great experience. Like I got so much out of it. Unfortunately, like we didn't progress past whatever, but like, you know, I'd do it again in a heartbeat. That type of thing.
Exactly. Just talk about the positive time that you have.
Yeah, because so much of that's so random anyway.
I will say that, because we've been talking about litigation, if you're interested in more transactional work, I think it's great to try to find something that shows those skills, because I think that those areas can be harder to kind of show why you want to get into it. And I do find that on the transactional side, they're looking for people who really do want to do it, so whether it's just corporate work or real estate or, whatever it is. If you can find something that kind of shows that, like, you learned about deals and contracts and, stuff like that, and that, you took a class or there was some extracurricular, I think that's something that can mean something.
Right, because that's definitely much harder.
Yeah.
Law school, let's face it, is sort of focused on the experience of the litigator, whether that's what people are going to do or not. So I think, and in some cases this could be class-based. You're doing some sort of, I think a good one is often like a drafting class can be really good.
Yeah, I think that's great.
But yeah, any type of, sometimes, I think schools are trying harder here, so that you may see clinics and that kind of thing that are more transactionally based. But it's definitely harder.
And I've seen some students do summer options. So sometimes you can fit that in depending on what your job is to do some kind of class or something like that is focused on, transactional areas. And this is particularly if you didn't like have a career in these kind of areas before. I think that those practice groups sometimes look for the people that, were former investment bankers,
right,
or something like that before law school. And that doesn't have to be you, and you could want to go into corporate work. But I think you should think really carefully about sort of classes and just like options that tell the story that that's what you want to do.
Right. I've even seen some pro bono work where you help people incorporate and that kind of thing in the community. That's pretty low level, but at the same time, it at least shows that like, oh, I'm interested in doing this. Like I want to work with clients who do business stuff, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And there actually are a lot of pro bono activities on that side. And I think that doesn't come to mind, right away. Everything seems more litigation focused, even on the pro bono side, but there definitely are opportunities, particularly like work with nonprofits, things like that.
Yeah. Or even I've heard of people having like outside jobs with a nonprofit or even with startups and things like that. And I think that's a great use of that outside job time. Even if you're working, say, 10 hours a week at a startup, that would be fantastic. An employer would love that.
Absolutely. I agree.
All right. Well, what about the situation where someone wants to do some of these activities, but they can't? So, for example, they don't make it onto law review. Maybe they're not accepted into their first choice clinic. What do people do? Should they just give up? Should they like do a fallback option? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think you should give up as long as, again, your grades are fine and you're not giving up because you kind of can't handle it aside from school. I think, you move down the list and you say like, what out of the options that I could definitely volunteer to do, would be open to me now. I think like a clinic is a great option. And I think most people usually can find those opportunities. Yeah, something where you're volunteering, something where you're just offering your services, I think is great. It does seem like if you want to get onto some kind of journal, you can.
Yeah, I think honestly, I think it looks a little weird when people are not on any type of journal because most schools have a lot and some of them do not really require a huge time commitment. So I always think it looks a little strange when someone doesn't done any type of journal work, just because I think it is actually, I hated it, but it was still useful for me to learn how to blue book and that kind of thing. So I do think
I agree, most people I see have at least one.
Yeah, and it doesn't, frankly, like, unless the person went to your school, they're not really going to know that, like, this was not a huge time commitment. So I think if you say law review doesn't pan out, I think there is some benefit to being on some journal that you can at least put on your resume.
I agree. Although I will say there are some kind of obscure ones where, like, you want to make sure how it sounds and how it's going to look because they're going to sort of question you on it. And some things that seem a little... I don't know what the right word is.
Just off. You can kind of see. Again, like sometimes you can be like, is that like a real thing? And maybe it is.
The same with some classes, particularly at schools where they have a lot of, sort of electives and the classes just sound real light.
Like law and basket weaving type things.
Yes, exactly. So I've seen that with journals as well. So just think about it. How would this sound to an outside person?
Right. Would they understand that I actually did work? And you can also, if you feel like you need to, you can kind of beef it up, list it and then say, time commitment of like 20 hours a week or whatever it was. If you feel like you have to do that.
Absolutely.
Well, speaking of classes and grades, one of the things people are kind of usually balancing in this calculus is, when should you take a hard class that you think is going to be relevant, you think is going to be a good class for you and for your career, even if you think you might not get the best grade? So something like Fed Courts or like some advanced tax classes, these kind of like really notorious classes that you're pretty sure your grade is not going to be an A+.
So this is a real tough call. I think it depends on how your whole schedule looks. Because you are kind of looking at the whole GPA. I also think it depends. Like you said, are you not going to get an A+ or are you going to fail?
Right. There's a big difference.
So yeah, there is a big difference. I think it's okay to sacrifice a little bit of the highest grade for a class that's challenging, because I will say I've seen it a lot where employers look and they're like, wow, they picked a really easy schedule.
Right. Like,
so
why didn't they take these classes?
Yeah, particularly if it's something where you think it's going to help you, you think it's really relevant. And this is a case where, especially if you know an area you want to get into, I would try to network and talk to attorneys in that area. Ask them what classes they think you should take. Mm-hmm. They love that. And it's actually really relevant.
Yeah. No, I mean, I asked the judge I was going to be working for that, and he's like, well, obviously you need to take evidence. Beyond that, I don't really care. He's like, and you should already be taking evidence for the bar exam. So like, hopefully you've signed up for evidence. I'm like, I have signed up for it my final semester. So it's fresh for the bar and for you. He's like, great. That's all we need. But like when I was looking when I should take Fed Courts, if I'd taken it as a 2L, I was going to be taking it the same semester I was doing all this law review stuff. And I was like, that sounds like an absolute nightmare. And it's like a notorious gunner class. So like everybody's going to be gunning. So I just took it as a 3L and I was much more relaxed, and that worked out fine.
I think that is a great choice. And that's why I was saying, I think you got to look at your whole schedule, your life, and have it make sense. And obviously you don't want to set yourself up for failure, across the board, because then it's not going to matter,
right?
That you took these really hard classes. So I think you kind of have to look at the whole thing. And the other thing is, if it's something like you said, where you're going to take it 3L year and you are, and you've kind of looked at your schedule, that's something you can tell them proactively, right, even if it's before that time. I actually think that's great.
True. That's a good point. You're like, well, I will be taking Fed Courts in the fall. I just don't have a grade for it. Actually, I know I'm doing really well in it, which I don't know why, but I think the professors liked me.
Well, maybe because you planned it. You didn't have so much other stuff going on.
I think it might be because we had the same last name, but I don't know. So what about rising 3Ls? We were talking about this a little bit. Is it too late to do this type of planning now, or do they still have options?
I think that there's never options until you're done. There's never not options.
Right. There are always options.
Yeah. I think that until you graduate, you can always make a change. And, especially if you think you're going to be in the market and looking for, a job, and they're going to see that stuff. I think that there's still time to do things. I don't think you should just give up because you're a 3L. A lot of people do if you already have a job and you don't really want to challenge yourself. But I actually think that it's nice to continue. You're paying for this education. It's an opportunity. And aside from how it's going to look to employers, maybe you'll gain some skills and learn something.
Maybe you'll actually learn something from this money that you're spending. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think the 3L year has a lot of flexibility, and obviously you can use that flexibility to do nothing, which fine, you do you. But I think you can also use it, say, for example, you weren't able to get into the clinic you wanted as a 2L because oftentimes it's harder as a 2L. You may have better options as a 3L. So you might relook at your schedule and say, you know what, actually that would be an interesting thing for me to do. Let me try and leverage my 3L position to get into that. And oftentimes you'll be able to. So I think, you're going to have more time. You may as well use it doing something that, is not just sitting around playing video games.
Absolutely. On the other hand, don't forget about your grades throughout the year either when you're making these decisions, because I have seen people get their offers rescinded because the job is going to ask for your final transcript. And if something really bad happened, they will notice that.
You failed like 3 classes.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm not saying that that's a common thing. And usually people can kind of, sail by okay. But just be careful.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to totally dial it in for sure. And also it can affect whether you're getting, honors and things like that. And, obviously that's something that may not seem like that big a deal at the time. It will definitely carry through if you have honors or don't have honors on your transcript and your school gives them. Like that can actually be something people do look at later on.
Definitely. Because, it's not just your first job, it's down the line.
Right, exactly. It always looks good to have like special honors. So, make sure that you're not going to like not get something that you would otherwise get just because you dial it in on one silly class.
Also, it's like, what does that say to them? Even if they don't take away your job, it still says to them, I just kind of gave up and I don't really care.
Yeah, I don't really care. It doesn't send the best signal.
Exactly. So, stick with everything. And, you can hopefully fit in some of these things that maybe you didn't get to do before.
Exactly. All right. Well, we're about out of time. Any final thoughts on this?
That really, like I said, this is all sort of a balance. So I would sort of look at the big picture and say, what activities and what other things can I do to sort of fill in aside from my classes, and what kind of message does this send about who I am?
Right, and what you're looking for and what you know and what you're interested in. Because again, you're always going to be telling that story. So how does this fit into the storyline? And, it doesn't have to all fit perfectly, but it should kind of go together.
Exactly.
All right, well, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. For more career help and the opportunity to work one-on-one with us, you can check out careerdicta.com. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We would really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.